Darfur is a complex conflict, and of course you can't ascribe simple drivers to it, but I think there are three drivers that, properly understood, can shed a lot of light on the situation. And those three would be ethnicity, oil, and desertification. Now, if I start with ethnicity, well, obviously, in a lot of these kinds of conflicts, ethnicity is a main driver. There's a lot of ethnic hatred, and that, under the right circumstances, could blossom into the most incredible violence. Now, what is the Sudan, this country that contains the Darfur region? It's effectively three really disparate regions thrown together into one country by the departing colonial power, Britain. And like most African borders, the border around the country of Sudan bears very little relationship to any kind of geographical truth or any demographic truth, and it has not much to do with the people there. Now, the north of Sudan, ethnically Arabic, religiously Muslim, is one sort of solitude, which borders on the Red Sea. So you've got the Port Sudan up there, and you've got the capital city of Khartoum. The south of Sudan, which is ethnically black and religiously Christian, is yet another solitude. Those two actually didn't even come together until after independence, with some fairly catastrophic results. And then you've got western Sudan, the Darfur, or the land of the Fur, where the Fur tribe, as well as the Masalit and the Zagawa live, as well as various Arab and affiliated nomadic tribes. Now, the Fur, the Masalit, and the Zagawa are ethnically black, religiously Muslim. Now, the ethnicity, the hatreds, are fostered by this sort of hierarchy where the more Arabic or the paler skinned you are, the higher you are in the hierarchy, or the more advanced you're considered to be. So, the Arabs in Khartoum, the Muslim Arabs in the capital city, and that capital city incidentally was founded as a slave market to sell black people. Now, they consider themselves proudly Arabs, and they really look down on black people. In fact, they use a very nasty word for black people, which means slave. Now, they themselves would be referred to by Saudi Arabs by that same very nasty word for a black person. Now, the people in the south identify themselves as black, and the people in the west also, the three main tribes in the Darfur, they consider themselves ethnically black. And they don't feel like that's a good thing. Being black means effectively that you get kicked around by everyone else. Also, within this area, there are ethnically Arabic tribes who look indistinguishable to the black tribes, to my eye, to most Western eyes. And often they can tell one another apart only by accent or last name. But these nomadic herding tribes, who are more culturally affiliated with the Arab government in Khartoum, live within the population of the Darfur. So there's already this ethnic tension in place and this terrible hierarchy and these terrible ideas of superiority between the various African peoples. Now let's talk about the second driver, which is oil. And what oil really functions as is a proxy for international conflict. Wherever there's oil, there's people jockeying for position and jockeying for that money. What you've got in the south of Sudan is oil wells. In the north of Sudan, you've got the port. You need both. So in the south where they have the oil wells, the oil is being extracted, but the people in Khartoum, in the north, where they have the port, are the ones who are seeing the payments come in. And that's had a lot to do with why they're able to keep power and hold power. And where does that oil go? Well, it goes to a few different countries. Canada has had some involvement in the Sudan. Talisman Oil out of Calgary certainly supported the Sudanese government for a time. But 70% or more of the oil out of the Sudan goes to China. So all of the money was staying in the northern part, and the southern tribe said, well, why aren't we seeing any of the benefits from this? Why aren't we having roads and hospitals and schools and any of the infrastructure that would normally come with a government that's got some kind of a budget? And they asked that question of the north, and back in the 1980s, the government said, well, because we have the money, why would we give it to you? So they launched a rebellion. And that southern rebellion raged for 22 years of absolutely horrendous violence and horrendous atrocities on both sides. And eventually the South won. And with that came, at least on paper, 49% of the oil revenues came down to the South. So that meant suddenly, at least in theory, there's infrastructure, education, healthcare going to the south of Sudan. Now over in the West, Darfur is left out of this. And these ethnically black, religiously Muslim, so not terribly related to the other two groups, said, well, what about us? Why aren't we seeing any schools and roads and infrastructure? So the West launched their own rebellion. And it's amazing what you can accomplish with very limited military means. And the Sudanese government was actually feeling quite pressed, pushed on the west by the Darfur rebels, always a little unsure of the peace with the south, harried on the Eritrean border by unrelated external conflicts, definitely in a dicey position. So they came back to their friends the Chinese. And the Sudanese government said to the Chinese, we're having difficulty with this rebellion. And the Chinese said, well, we can help with that. To secure our oil supply, we can supply you with all kinds of good modern military weapons. So they supplied Antonov bombers and helicopter gunships and Kalashnikov AK-47 rifles. And the Sudanese government came up with a new way to fight a war. And to fight this rebellion, they decided to get the fish by draining the sea. The fish are the rebels. The sea is the civilian population of Western Sudan, the civilians of Darfur. So the modus operandi is quite simple. You take a village of black agricultural tribespeople who are considered to be rebel sympathizers, which they probably are, and you soften it up with bombs from an Antonov bomber overhead during the night. And then at dawn come in with a helicopter gunship with a high-powered machine gun. And after that, the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback, ride in, nomadic Arab tribespeople from Western Sudan, sponsored and financed by the government, and they start shooting up the rest of the civilians. And they rape the women on a very large scale. It's one of the larger instances of organized rape in history. And then they burn all of the houses. And the hatred is so extreme that they'll actually dig up food stores and use petroleum that they've purchased. They'll use diesel oil that they've had to buy from the market to pour on the food stores and destroy them. And then they'll throw dead bodies in the wells to make sure that the village never recovers. So there we have oil functioning as sort of a proxy for international interference. The people who are buying these resources coming out of these poor countries are supporting the governments that may or may not be acceptable to their own peoples and giving them military, financial support. So the third driver then is desertification. How did the government convince these tribes, the ethnic Arab tribes in the west of Darfur, to turn against their own people and start massacring the other tribes of the Darfur? Well, historically, the herders, the ethnic Arab herders of the Darfur region, and the ethnically black farmers had a bit of an understanding. If a farmer had a field of grains and a cow walked through it and trashed it, well, the herder had to pay some kind of grazing rights to the farmer. And for thousands of years, they coexisted with certainly a certain amount of tension. Always throughout history, there's tension between herders and farmers. And though there were skirmishes and there were certainly problems, there was an existing social structure whereby there were grazing rights for cattle who went through a farmer's field, and farmers would allow that. Now the Sahara Desert is extending. And this may or may not be related to the climate change that we're causing here in the West, but whatever the cause may be, there's no longer enough for everyone. The farmers and the herders do not have enough arable land and enough water to irrigate to actually sustain those old accords. So the fact is, the Darfur region is no longer able to sustain the lifestyle that the people had, which was not a very luxurious lifestyle. This is a hard region. And now it's even harder, to the point where, though the match was struck by these drivers of ethnic hatred and external forces supplying arms and financial incentives, the fuel for this fire really was created by the fact that there just isn't enough for everyone anymore. And so all of those three drivers work together to create a sort of a perfect storm of massacre and despair. And in fact, there's going to be oil, there's going to be people jockeying for that oil. There is this terrible ethnicity and these terrible hatreds that are not going away anytime soon. And certainly I don't see any reversal in the desertification of North Africa. As long as those three things remain in place, it's going to be very difficult to mitigate the conflict in Darfur.